The iron gates of Pinecrest Reform School for Boys groaned shut behind Samuel Hayes on a blistering August morning in 1885, sealing him inside what the Texas authorities called a house of redemption. The 14-year-old boy clutched his threadbare bundle of possessions as the wagon driver who had transported him from the Houston courthouse departed without a backward glance, leaving only dust and the acrid smell of horse sweat hanging in the oppressive heat. Samuel's crime had been stealing bread from a merchant's stall to feed his dying mother, an offense that Judge Harlan Porter deemed worthy of 2 years of corrective discipline. The judge had spoken of reformation and moral guidance with the conviction of a man who had never known hunger, never watched a parent waste away from consumption in a tenement room where the rent consumed every penny of honest labor. The main building of Pinecrest rose before Samuel like a tombstone against the cloudless sky, its red brick walls absorbing and radiating the merciless Texas sun until the very air seemed to shimmer with fever. The structure had been built before the war, originally intended as a cotton warehouse before the state purchased it and transformed it into an institution for wayward youth. 3 stories of barred windows stared down at the courtyard like dead eyes, and Samuel felt his stomach tighten with a fear he couldn't quite name. The grounds stretched for acres, surrounded by a wooden fence topped with rusted iron spikes, and beyond that, the flat expanse of scrubland that characterized this remote corner of East Texas extended to the horizon in every direction. The nearest town, a collection of weathered buildings called Millwood, lay 7 miles to the south, far enough that the screams of the boys inside would never reach civilian ears. A guard materialized from the shadow of the entrance portico, his uniform stained with sweat and something darker around the collar. He was a thick-shouldered man with a face like cured leather, his eyes small and mean in the way of men who have learned to enjoy the exercise of petty power. Without speaking, he grabbed Samuel by the arm with fingers that dug into flesh like iron clamps and dragged him through the heavy oak doors into the interior of the building. The temperature inside was somehow worse than outside, the heat trapped and concentrated by the brick walls, mixing with odors that made Samuel's eyes water, unwashed bodies, mildew, urine, and beneath it all, a sickly sweet smell of decay that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The guard hauled him down a corridor lined with doors, each bearing a small barred window, past a staircase that descended into darkness from which came the sound of water dripping and something else, a low sound that might have been moaning or might have been the settling of old timbers. They stopped before a door marked with the words Warden Augustus Pike in careful brass letters. The guard knocked twice, paused, then knocked once more in what was clearly an established pattern. A voice from within commanded them to enter, and Samuel found himself pushed into a spacious office that stood in stark contrast to the squalor of the corridors. The room was furnished with obvious care. A massive mahogany desk, polished to a mirror shine, leather-bound books lining shelves along 2 walls, a Turkish rug of deep crimson covering most of the floor. Behind the desk sat a man of perhaps 50 years, impeccably dressed in a black suit, despite the heat, his silver hair combed back from a high forehead. Augustus Pike had the face of a preacher or a banker, distinguished and severe, with pale blue eyes that seemed to look through Samuel rather than at him. A grandfather clock in the corner ticked with mechanical precision, the only sound in the room for a long moment. Warden Pike did not rise or offer any greeting. Instead, he opened a leather folder on his desk and appeared to read its contents with great concentration, though Samuel suspected this was mere theatre, a display of authority. Finally, without looking up, Pike spoke in a voice that was surprisingly soft, almost cultured, with only the faintest trace of southern accent. He recited the details of Samuel's case with clinical detachment, the theft, the sentence, the notation that the boy's mother had died 3 days after his conviction. Pike paused at this last fact, and something that might have been satisfaction flickered across his features before vanishing. He closed the folder and finally lifted his gaze to meet Samuel's eyes. What Samuel saw in that gaze made his blood run cold, not anger or cruelty exactly, but something worse, a complete absence of human warmth, eyes like chips of winter ice that calculated and measured but never felt. The warden explained the philosophy of Pinecrest in measured tones that would have sounded reasonable in any other context. The school, he said, operated on principles of strict discipline and the breaking of willful spirit that led boys astray. Here they learned obedience, submission to rightful authority, and the abandonment of the selfish impulses that had brought them into conflict with society. The methods employed at Pinecrest, Pike continued, had been developed over years of careful study and represented the most advanced thinking on juvenile correction. Some boys learned quickly, he noted, while others required more intensive instruction. The duration of a boy's stay often depended not on his sentence, but on how completely he embraced his reformation. Samuel would be assigned to dormitory C on the second floor, would rise at 5 each morning for chapel, work in the laundry or fields until midday meal, attend instruction in the afternoon, work again until evening meal, and retire at 8 o'clock. Any deviation from this schedule, any infraction of the numerous rules that governed Pinecrest, would result in corrective measures proportional to the offense. As Pike spoke, Samuel became aware of a smell in the office, faint but distinct, that seemed out of place among the polished wood and leather, the same odor of decay he had detected in the corridors, as though something had died in the walls and was slowly rotting. The warden seemed not to notice, or perhaps he had become so accustomed to it that it no longer registered. When Pike finished his speech, he rang a small brass bell on his desk, and a different guard appeared. This one younger, but with the same dead expression in his eyes. Samuel was led out through a different door than the one by which he had entered, and the last thing he saw as he glanced back was Warden Pike watching him with those glacial eyes, a slight smile playing at the corners of his thin lips. The dormitory was a long room with 30 narrow cots arranged in 2 rows, each covered with a thin blanket that might once have been grey, but had faded to an indeterminate colour between brown and black. The windows, though barred, at least allowed some circulation of air, providing minimal relief from the stifling heat. Most of the beds were empty at this hour, their occupants presumably at work or instruction, but a handful of boys remained. Samuel immediately noticed their condition. Gaunt faces with skin stretched tight over bones, eyes sunken and ringed with dark circles, movements that seemed to require tremendous effort. One boy, who could not have been more than 12, lay curled on his cot, shaking despite the heat, his lips cracked and bleeding. Another sat on the edge of his bed, staring at nothing, his arms wrapped around his midsection, as though trying to hold himself together. The guard shoved Samuel toward an empty cot in the middle of the room and departed without instruction. For a long moment, Samuel stood uncertain, until one of the boys, slightly older than the others, rose from his bed and approached. His name was Thomas Crawford, and he had been at Pinecrest for 11 months, though his sentence had been for only 6. Thomas had the same hollow-eyed appearance as the others, but there remained in his face some spark of defiance that had not yet been fully extinguished. He spoke in a low voice, glancing frequently toward the door as though expecting the guard to return. What he told Samuel in those first few minutes would have seemed like the ravings of a fever dream, if not for the evidence all around them. Pinecrest was not a reform school, but a carefully orchestrated chamber of horrors, and Warden Pike was not an educator but a sadist who had perfected the art of breaking human beings while maintaining the facade of institutional respectability. The methods Pike employed were ingenious in their cruelty, because they left few visible marks and could be explained away as necessary discipline or natural consequences of the boy's own bad behavior. The work assigned to the inmates was deliberately designed to be both exhausting and pointless, digging holes only to fill them in again, carrying water in buckets with holes in the bottom, scrubbing floors that would be immediately dirtied. The chapel services that began each day consisted of 3-hour sermons delivered by Pike himself, during which the boys were required to kneel on bare wooden floors while the warden expounded on sin and punishment with the fervor of an Old Testament prophet. Any boy who shifted position or showed signs of discomfort during these sessions would be noted and later subjected to corrective measures. The instruction periods in the afternoon consisted primarily of copying Bible verses in careful script, and any mistake, any blotted ink or crooked letter, would result in the entire page being copied again, sometimes dozens of times. But the true horror of Pinecrest, Thomas explained in a voice that dropped to barely a whisper, lay in the food. The midday and evening meals were served in a dining hall on the first floor, a cavernous room with long wooden tables and benches. The boys filed in under the watchful eyes of guards and sat in assigned places, forbidden to speak. The meals were brought out in large pots by older boys who worked in the kitchen under the supervision of a cook named Mrs. Fowler, a woman whose appearance suggested she never sampled her own creations. What was served bore little resemblance to actual food, a grey slop that might have started as some form of grain porridge, accompanied by chunks of meat floating in greasy water. The meat was the problem. Thomas's voice shook as he described it. Meat that was grey-green in colour, that smelled of putrefaction, that left an oily film on the tongue and a taste of corruption that no amount of water could wash away. Warden Pike insisted that every boy clean his plate at every meal. Guards patrolled the dining hall, watching for any attempt to hide food or avoid eating. Any boy who refused to eat would be taken to the basement, to the room the guards called the reflection chamber, and kept there without food or water until his attitude improved. Most boys, after a day or two in that lightless room, would eat anything. The consequences of consuming the spoiled meat were predictable and devastating: violent stomach cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, fever. The infirmary, such as it was, consisted of a room with a dozen cots and no medical staff beyond an elderly man who had once been a veterinarian and who treated the boys with the same indifference he might show to sick livestock. Boys who became too ill to work were sometimes taken away, and Thomas had known several who had simply disappeared, never to return. When parents or authorities inquired, Warden Pike would produce records showing the boy had been released or transferred, documents that existed only in his fabricated ledgers. The question that haunted Samuel as he listened to Thomas's account was why? Why would Pike do this? The answer, Thomas believed, lay in the warden's twisted philosophy of reformation. Pike genuinely believed that he was performing a service, that by breaking the boys' spirits so completely, by reducing them to such abject misery that they would accept any authority without question, he was preparing them for productive lives as submissive laborers. Pike saw the boys sent to Pinecrest not as human beings deserving of care and guidance, but as defective machines that required harsh recalibration. The spoiled meat was not simply neglect or cost-cutting, though it certainly saved the institution money. It was a deliberate tool of control. A boy who was constantly sick, constantly weak, constantly battling the effects of food poisoning, was a boy who lacked the strength to resist, to plan, to hope. The physical suffering created a psychological state of learned helplessness, and that was precisely what Pike desired. As the afternoon wore on and the other boys began returning from their various work assignments, Samuel had the opportunity to observe the full scope of Pinecrest's population. There were perhaps 90 boys in total, ranging in age from 10 to 17, though many looked far younger or older than their actual years due to malnutrition and stress. Their crimes were uniformly minor: theft, vagrancy, truancy, in some cases nothing more than being poor and orphaned. They moved with the shuffling gait of the elderly, spoke in whispers if they spoke at all, and kept their eyes downcast in the presence of guards. The hierarchy among them reflected the institution's cruelty. A few boys, those who had fully embraced Pike's system and now acted as informants and enforcers, enjoyed slightly better treatment and used their marginal power to torment the others. These boys, called trustees, wore clean uniforms and ate slightly less contaminated food, privileges they guarded jealously and maintained by reporting any hint of dissent or rule-breaking to the warden. That first evening meal confirmed everything Thomas had described. Samuel filed into the dining hall with the others, took his assigned seat at one of the long tables, and waited in silence as the trustees brought out the pots. The smell alone was enough to make him gag. The sweet, rotten odor of meat that had gone far past its edible date, mixed with the smell of rancid grease and something chemical, perhaps the lime or sulfur Pike used in a futile attempt to mask the decay. When the slop was ladled into his tin bowl, Samuel could see chunks of grey-green meat swimming in watery broth. Fat congealed on the surface in yellowish lumps. The boy next to him, a thin child with vacant eyes, began eating mechanically, shoveling the contents of his bowl into his mouth with the resignation of someone who had long since given up any expectation of better. Samuel tried to eat. He managed 3 spoonfuls before his stomach rebelled, and he felt bile rising in his throat. Across the room, a guard was watching him, and Samuel forced himself to take another spoonful. Then another. The taste was indescribable, beyond mere unpleasantness, into something that seemed fundamentally wrong, as though the meat had not simply spoiled, but transformed into some other substance entirely. He saw other boys vomiting into their bowls and then being forced by guards to consume even that, saw boys weeping silently as they ate, saw the trustees smirking from their separate table where their food, while still poor, was at least not actively poisonous. Samuel managed to consume perhaps half his bowl before his body's rejection became too violent to ignore. He ran from the table to a corner of the room and vomited until his stomach was empty, heaving with dry convulsions as a guard approached. The guard was the same leather-faced man who had first brought Samuel to the warden's office. He looked down at the boy with something that might have been satisfaction and informed him that his behavior represented a breach of regulations and that he would report it to Warden Pike. Samuel was too weak to respond, too sick to care about threats. He was dragged back to his dormitory and left on his cot, where he spent the night in agony, his stomach cramping, his head pounding, alternating between chills and fever. Thomas brought him water during the night, risking punishment to offer this small mercy, and whispered that it would pass, that the body eventually adapted, learned to tolerate what it must tolerate. Samuel wondered, in his delirium, whether that adaptation was not worse than death, whether learning to accept the unacceptable was not the final defeat of the human spirit. The following morning, despite his illness, Samuel was roused at 5 for chapel. The service was held in a converted assembly room, bare and cold despite the summer heat, with wooden benches arranged in rows before a simple pulpit. Warden Pike stood at that pulpit in his immaculate black suit, a Bible open before him, though Samuel suspected the warden knew his sermon by heart and the book was merely a prop. For 3 hours, Pike preached about sin and punishment, about the corrupt nature of youth, about the need for absolute obedience to divine and earthly authority. His voice, soft in private conversation, rose to a thunderous bellow that echoed off the bare walls, then dropped to an intimate whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. He spoke of boys as vessels of wickedness that must be emptied before they could be filled with righteousness, of the necessity of suffering as a purifying force, of the pride and willfulness that had brought them all to this place. Throughout the sermon, Samuel knelt on the hard wooden floor, his knees aching, his stomach still cramping from the previous night's meal. Other boys shifted or swayed with exhaustion, and each such movement was noted by the guards who stood along the walls. Pike's eyes swept over his congregation with the intensity of a hawk watching for movement in grass, and when his gaze fell on Samuel, the boy felt naked, exposed, as though the warden could see not just his body, but his thoughts, his fears, his very soul. The sermon concluded with a prayer that lasted another 30 minutes, during which the boys were required to press their foreheads to the floor and remain absolutely motionless, while Pike called upon God to break their stubborn hearts and make them fit for service. When they were finally dismissed, several boys could barely stand, their legs numb from kneeling for so long. The days that followed established a pattern that would define Samuel's existence at Pinecrest. Each morning began with the ordeal of chapel, followed by work assignments that varied but were uniformly designed to exhaust and demoralize. Samuel was assigned to the laundry, a hell of steam and heat where he and a dozen other boys scrubbed sheets and uniforms in scalding water, using harsh lye soap that ate at their hands until the skin cracked and bled. The work was overseen by a guard named Jessup, a man who spoke rarely but wielded a leather strap with casual efficiency, striking any boy he deemed to be working too slowly. The laundry operated in near silence, broken only by the sound of scrubbing, the hiss of steam, and occasionally the crack of leather on flesh, followed by muffled cries. The afternoon instruction periods provided no relief. Samuel and the others were marched to a classroom where they sat at desks scarred with the initials and desperate messages of previous inmates, given sheets of paper and pens, and required to copy Bible verses in perfect script. The passages Pike selected were always about obedience, submission, the wages of sin. Any mistake meant starting over, and the same passage might be copied 20, 30, 40 times until the words lost all meaning and became mere shapes on paper. A teacher, a thin man with nervous eyes who had clearly been broken by his own employment at Pinecrest, prowled between the desks, examining the work, occasionally striking a desk with his ruler to startle a boy who was beginning to nod off from exhaustion. But it was the meals that remained the central horror of Pinecrest, the twice-daily ritual that poisoned body and spirit alike. Samuel learned to identify the varying degrees of decay in the meat by color and smell. Green-gray was perhaps a week past edibility. Grey-brown was older still, and the worst was a dark purple-gray that indicated advanced putrefaction. The source of this meat remained unclear, though Thomas speculated that Pike had an arrangement with slaughterhouses and butchers to purchase condemned meat at reduced prices, meat that was supposed to be burned or buried, but instead found its way to Pinecrest's kitchen. Mrs. Fowler, the cook, boiled it in huge pots with lime and salt in a futile attempt to kill the bacteria, but this only created the chemical taste that underlay the rot. Samuel's body began to adapt in the way Thomas had predicted, though adaptation felt like defeat. After the first week, he could eat the spoiled meat without immediately vomiting, though it still caused terrible stomach cramps and diarrhea that left him weak and dehydrated. He lost weight rapidly, his ribs beginning to show through his skin, his face taking on the gaunt, haunted appearance of the other boys. His hands, raw from laundry work, became infected, the cracks in his skin filling with pus that he had to squeeze out each night. His knees developed permanent bruises from the daily 3-hour kneeling during chapel. But worse than the physical deterioration was the psychological toll, the slow erosion of hope that he watched in himself and others. There was a boy named William, 13 years old, who had been sent to Pinecrest for the crime of running away from an abusive foster home. William had arrived a month before Samuel and had initially refused to eat the spoiled meat, enduring multiple sessions in the reflection chamber as punishment. The reflection chamber was in the basement, a room perhaps 6 feet by 6 feet, with no windows and a door that sealed so tightly that not even a crack of light penetrated. Boys sent there were stripped to their undergarments and left in complete darkness, sometimes for days at a time. The only sound was the dripping of water from pipes somewhere in the walls, a maddening irregular rhythm that marked time in the absence of any other sensory input. Boys emerged from the reflection chamber changed, their eyes distant, their will broken. William had spent 5 days there during his second week and had been eating the meat without protest ever since, but something essential in him had been extinguished. He moved like a puppet, spoke in a flat monotone when he spoke at all, and sometimes woke screaming in the night from dreams he could not or would not describe. As the weeks passed, Samuel began to understand the full depth of Pike's system and the terrible genius behind it. Every aspect of Pinecrest was designed to create a state of learned helplessness, to convince the boys that resistance was futile, that authority was absolute, that their suffering was deserved. The physical deprivations, the constant illness from the poisoned food, the exhausting work, the sleep deprivation, all of these broke down the body's ability to maintain psychological resistance. The humiliation of the chapel services, where Pike would sometimes single out individual boys to stand before the group and confess their wickedness, created shame and isolation. The informant system, where trustees were rewarded for reporting on their fellow inmates, destroyed trust and made collective resistance impossible. And underlying all of it was the spoiled meat, the daily reminder that they were not considered worthy of even basic sustenance, that they were less than human in the eyes of their keepers. Samuel watched boys deteriorate before his eyes. A child named Robert, barely 11, developed dysentery from the meat and spent 2 weeks in the infirmary, emerging so weak he could barely walk. He was given no recovery time but was immediately put back to work in the fields, where he collapsed within an hour. The guards dragged him to the reflection chamber for malingering, and when he emerged 3 days later, he was changed. Something broken in his mind as well as his body. Another boy, James, who had been at Pinecrest for nearly 2 years, developed what appeared to be scurvy, his gums bleeding, teeth loosening in his mouth. The veterinarian who served as medical staff shrugged and said that the boy must not be eating his fruits and vegetables. An absurd diagnosis, given that no fruits or vegetables had been seen at Pinecrest in living memory. James simply faded over the course of several weeks, growing weaker and more listless, until one morning he did not wake up. His body was taken away, and Warden Pike announced at chapel that James had been released to his family, though everyone knew this was a lie. The death of James sparked something in Samuel that he had thought the institution had already killed: rage. It was a cold rage, born not of impulse, but of deep understanding. He realized that what was happening at Pinecrest was not correction or reformation, but systematic destruction. That Pike was not trying to improve them, but to break them so completely that they would accept any abuse, any exploitation, any injustice as their natural lot. The boys who left Pinecrest, if they survived, would be perfect laborers for the factories and plantations and mines that fed the new industrial economy, obedient, uncomplaining, incapable of organizing or resisting, broken in spirit if not in body. Pike was not an aberration, but a reflection of a system that viewed the poor and powerless as raw material to be processed and used. Samuel began to observe Pinecrest with new eyes, looking for weaknesses in Pike's system. He noted the patterns of the guards' rounds, the times when supervision was lightest, the locations where boys might gather without being observed. He paid attention during the work assignments, noting which trustees were true believers in Pike's system and which were simply desperate boys trying to survive by any means available. He listened carefully during chapel, not to the content of Pike's sermons, but to the warden's mannerisms, his tells, the moments when his facade of religious conviction slipped and revealed the sadist beneath. And most importantly, Samuel began to talk to other boys, carefully, quietly, feeling out who still retained some spark of defiance, who might be willing to risk punishment for the possibility of something better. He found allies in unexpected places. Thomas, who had first warned him about Pinecrest, was an obvious choice, but there were others. A boy named Daniel, 16 years old and sentenced for the crime of organizing a strike at a textile mill, had a mind sharpened by adversity and a deep understanding of how power operated. A pair of brothers, Henry and Charles, who had been convicted of poaching on a wealthy landowner's property, had survived by maintaining a fierce loyalty to each other. A quiet boy named Michael, who rarely spoke, but whose eyes showed a keen intelligence, proved to have an almost photographic memory for the layout of the building and the habits of the staff. Together, in whispered conversations during the few unsupervised moments in the dormitory or laundry, they began to form a plan. The plan was not escape, not at first. Escape from Pinecrest was nearly impossible given its remote location, the alertness of the guards, and the weakened condition of the boys. But there was something they could do. Document what was happening, and get that documentation to someone outside who might care. Daniel suggested that they needed proof, not just testimony, which could be dismissed as the lies of criminals, but physical evidence that could not be denied. The spoiled meat was that evidence. If they could somehow preserve samples of what they were being fed, along with written accounts of the conditions at Pinecrest, and smuggle these materials out, they might spark an investigation that would shut down the institution. The implementation of this plan required extraordinary courage and coordination. Samuel volunteered to be the one to preserve meat samples, using small glass bottles stolen from the veterinarian's supply room during a work assignment. The challenge was keeping the bottles hidden and obtaining samples without being caught by the guards who supervised meals. Samuel developed a technique of palming small pieces of meat during the chaos of serving and slipping them into his pocket, where he had sewn hidden compartments into the lining. After meals, in the dormitory during the brief period before lights out, he would transfer the meat to the bottles, seal them, and hide them in a loose floorboard under his cot that Michael had discovered. The smell was overwhelming, but it could be attributed to the general miasma of the dormitory. Meanwhile, Daniel began writing a detailed account of conditions at Pinecrest on scraps of paper obtained during instruction periods. He wrote in tiny, careful script, documenting every abuse, every death, every systematic cruelty. The boys contributed their own stories, their own observations, building a comprehensive picture of Pike's operation. The challenge was finding someone outside to receive these materials. The solution came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Fowler, the cook. Despite her complicity in serving poisoned food, she was herself a victim of Pike's system, paid a pittance, and threatened with dismissal if she complained about the quality of meat she was given to prepare. Henry, who worked in the kitchen, began carefully cultivating a relationship with her, expressing sympathy for her position, suggesting that she too was trapped in an unjust system. Over several weeks, Henry's patient work paid off. Mrs. Fowler confessed that she hated what was being done to the boys, that she had tried to complain to Pike about the meat, but had been told that it was adequate for boys of their station, that she had considered leaving, but had no other means of support. Henry proposed that she could help them without risk to herself. She had a sister who lived in Houston, corresponded with her occasionally, and could simply include in her next letter a sealed envelope that the boys would provide. The sister, who knew nothing of Pinecrest's conditions, would mail the envelope to its addressed recipient as a favor. Mrs. Fowler agreed, motivated partly by conscience, and partly by Henry's subtle implication that when the investigation came, those who had helped the boys would be remembered favorably. The question of who to address their evidence to was critical. Daniel, who had been involved in labor organizing before his arrest, suggested they send it to a journalist he knew of in Houston, a man named Robert Mitchell who worked for the Houston Post and had a reputation for exposing institutional corruption. Mitchell had written articles about prison conditions, workplace safety violations, and the exploitation of child labor. If anyone would take their claims seriously and have the resources to investigate, it would be him. Samuel carefully printed Mitchell's name and address on an envelope using skills he had learned in his brief time in school before poverty had ended his education. Into that envelope went Daniel's written account, carefully folded, along with 2 of the glass bottles containing samples of the spoiled meat wrapped in cloth to prevent breaking. The transfer to Mrs. Fowler happened during a Sunday when the normal work routine was suspended and the boys attended extended chapel services, followed by a period of free time in the courtyard. Henry, assigned to kitchen duty that day to prepare the evening meal, found a moment when the supervising guard stepped away to speak with Pike, and he slipped the envelope to Mrs. Fowler with a whispered explanation. She took it with trembling hands and hid it in her apron. The next day was her scheduled afternoon off, when she walked to Millwood to visit the general store and post office. The boys could only wait and hope, returning to the grinding routine of Pinecrest, with the knowledge that they had done what they could, and the rest was beyond their control. Days passed, then a week, then 2. Life at Pinecrest continued its terrible rhythm. More boys fell ill from the meat. More boys were broken in the reflection chamber. More boys faded into that state of living death that characterized long-term inmates. Samuel began to lose hope that their message had reached Mitchell, or that if it had, the journalist had simply dismissed it as the fantasies of juvenile criminals. Warden Pike seemed to sense some subtle change in the atmosphere, some hint of resistance, and his sermons grew more intense, his punishments more severe. He began conducting random searches of the dormitories, looking for contraband, and Samuel lived in constant terror that the remaining bottles of meat hidden under his floorboard would be discovered. Then, on a Wednesday morning in late October, everything changed. The boys were in chapel for the daily service when a commotion arose from the direction of the main entrance. Voices were raised in argument, and Pike's sermon faltered as his attention shifted to the disturbance. A moment later, the chapel doors burst open, and a group of men strode in. 2 Texas Rangers in their distinctive uniforms, a well-dressed man carrying a notebook who could only be a journalist, and a doctor's bag-carrying gentleman who introduced himself as a health inspector from the State Medical Board. Behind them came Robert Mitchell, his face grim with barely contained rage. The journalist's eyes swept over the assembled boys, taking in their gaunt faces, their hollow eyes, their obvious malnourishment, and Samuel saw in Mitchell's expression a fury that matched his own. Warden Pike attempted to maintain his composure, greeting the visitors with professional courtesy and asking by what authority they entered his institution. The Rangers informed him that they carried a warrant to inspect Pinecrest based on credible allegations of mistreatment and abuse, that Pike was to cooperate fully or face immediate arrest for obstruction. Mitchell stepped forward and in a loud voice that carried to every corner of the chapel began reading from Daniel's account, the litany of horrors that had been perpetrated behind Pinecrest's walls. As he read, Pike's face transformed from its usual mask of benevolent authority into something ugly and desperate. He tried to interrupt, to dismiss the allegations as lies fabricated by criminals, but the Rangers silenced him. The inspection that followed was thorough and damning. The doctor examined boys at random, documenting malnutrition, untreated infections, injuries consistent with beatings, and multiple cases of food poisoning. The health inspector visited the kitchen, where he found the enormous pots in which Mrs. Fowler prepared meals, still containing residue of the spoiled meat. He collected samples, his face growing increasingly horrified as he realized the extent of the contamination. The meat storage room revealed the full scope of Pike's operation. Hundreds of pounds of condemned meat, much of it crawling with maggots, all of it weeks or months past any reasonable date of consumption. The inspector documented temperatures that were far too warm for safe food storage, containers that were rusted and dirty, and a complete absence of any sanitary practices. The rangers searched Pike's office and discovered the real ledgers, the ones that showed the actual food purchases versus the fabricated accounts Pike submitted to the state. They found evidence of embezzlement, of Pike purchasing condemned meat at pennies per pound and then claiming to the state that he was feeding the boys fresh provisions, pocketing the difference. They found correspondence with slaughterhouses and butchers arranging for the delivery of meat that was legally supposed to be destroyed. And in a locked drawer, they found Pike's personal journal, which contained entries that revealed his true beliefs, that the boys at Pinecrest were subhuman refuse whose suffering was not only deserved but necessary, that breaking their spirits was a service to society, that his methods would create a generation of obedient workers who would never question authority or demand better treatment. Mitchell interviewed boys throughout the day, taking careful notes, his anger visible in the tightness of his jaw and the tremor in his hands as he wrote. Samuel and the others told their stories, no longer afraid because the rangers were there and Pike was being held under guard in his own office. They described the reflection chamber, the endless sermons, the impossible work assignments, the systematic humiliation. They talked about boys who had died or disappeared, boys whose names were remembered even if their final fates were unknown. They showed the damage to their bodies, the infections, the bruises, the scars from beatings, and they testified about the meat, about being forced to consume food that they knew was poisoned, about the illness and pain that followed every meal. By evening, the rangers had enough evidence to arrest Pike, along with several of the guards and trustees who had participated in the abuse. Pike was led away in handcuffs, his facade finally shattered, screaming that he had done nothing wrong, that he had been trying to save the boys from themselves, that they would all end up as criminals and degenerates without his firm hand. The boys watched him go with a mixture of relief and disbelief, hardly able to credit that the nightmare was ending. Mitchell promised them that he would write a series of articles that would expose not just Pinecrest, but the entire system of juvenile correction that allowed such institutions to operate, that he would not rest until reforms were implemented and those responsible were punished. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. The state closed Pinecrest, pending a full investigation, and transferred the boys to other institutions, though Mitchell and the health inspector fought to ensure these transfers were to facilities with better conditions and oversight. Many of the boys required extensive medical treatment for malnutrition, parasitic infections, and the long-term effects of consuming contaminated food. Some would never fully recover. Samuel himself spent 2 months in a hospital in Houston, being nursed back to health by doctors who were shocked at his condition. The physical recovery was difficult, but the psychological scars ran deeper. Samuel woke screaming from nightmares about Pike's sermons, about the taste of rotting meat, about the darkness of the reflection chamber. Mitchell's articles appeared in the Houston Post over the course of several weeks, creating a sensation across Texas and beyond. He titled the series, "The Warden's Poison: How Texas Reform Schools Break Boys Instead of Saving Them," and the detailed accounts of Pinecrest's operations sparked public outrage. Editorials in newspapers across the state demanded investigation of similar institutions, questioning whether Pinecrest was an isolated case or symptomatic of a larger, systemic failure. Reformers seized on the scandal as evidence that the current approach to juvenile justice was fundamentally flawed, that institutions built on punishment and humiliation could never achieve genuine rehabilitation. Pike's trial became a media spectacle, with his crimes detailed in graphic testimony that many newspapers refused to print in full, deeming them too disturbing for general readership. Pike was convicted on multiple counts of child abuse, embezzlement, and involuntary manslaughter in the deaths of boys who had died from food poisoning or neglect. He received a sentence of 25 years in prison, and the judge who sentenced him expressed the hope that Pike would experience in prison even a fraction of the suffering he had inflicted on the boys in his care. Several guards and the most brutal of the trustees also received prison sentences. Though many of the lesser participants were never prosecuted, Mrs. Fowler testified for the prosecution, her cooperation ensuring that she faced no charges for her role in serving the contaminated food, though she left Texas afterward and was never heard from again. The veterinarian who had served as Pinecrest's medical staff had his license revoked and faced civil suits from families of boys who had died, but the larger questions raised by Pinecrest's exposure proved more difficult to answer. What had happened there was not, as Mitchell's continued investigation revealed, an isolated case of one sadistic warden, but rather an extreme example of attitudes and practices that were widespread in juvenile corrections. The belief that poor and troubled youth needed to be broken before they could be reformed, that harsh discipline and deprivation built character, that suffering was pedagogically valuable, these ideas permeated the system. Pinecrest had simply taken them to their logical and horrible conclusion. Other institutions, when investigated, were found to have their own abuses, though perhaps less systematic or extreme. The question became not just how to punish Pike, but how to reform an entire approach to juvenile justice. Samuel, once he recovered physically, found himself at the center of reform efforts. Mitchell introduced him to lawyers and activists who were working to change Texas law regarding juvenile corrections. Samuel testified before the state legislature, describing his experiences at Pinecrest and arguing that institutions built on punishment would always tend toward abuse, that genuine reformation required education, compassion, and the recognition of boys' fundamental humanity. His testimony was powerful precisely because he refused to present himself as a passive victim, but rather as someone who had resisted, who had maintained his dignity and sense of justice, even in the face of systematic efforts to destroy it. He spoke about the other boys, the ones who had not survived or who had been so damaged that they would never recover, and he demanded that their suffering not be in vain. The reforms that eventually emerged from the Pinecrest scandal were significant, though incomplete. Texas passed new laws requiring regular inspections of juvenile institutions by independent parties, mandating minimum standards for food, shelter, and medical care, and establishing oversight boards that included members of the public rather than just corrections officials. The practice of long-term solitary confinement for juveniles was banned, and limits were placed on the use of corporal punishment. Institutions were required to provide actual education rather than mere labor and religious instruction. These changes represented real progress, though activists like Mitchell recognized that laws on paper meant little without vigorous enforcement and continued public vigilance. For Samuel personally, the years after Pinecrest were a struggle to rebuild a life that had been derailed by poverty, injustice, and institutionalized cruelty. He had lost his mother, lost years of his youth, and carried psychological scars that would never fully heal. But he had also discovered a capacity for resistance and a commitment to justice that would define the rest of his life. He completed his education with the help of reformers who saw in him a powerful advocate for change. He became a journalist himself, following in Mitchell's footsteps, writing about conditions in prisons and reform schools, exposing abuse wherever he found it. He never married, never had children, as though some essential capacity for trust and intimacy had been damaged beyond repair at Pinecrest. In 1910, 25 years after his time at Pinecrest, Samuel returned to the site of the former institution. It had been closed since the scandal, The buildings left to decay as the state decided it was cheaper to abandon the facility than to renovate it. Samuel walked through the ruins, the dormitories where he had slept, the chapel where he had been forced to kneel for hours, the dining hall where he had consumed poison. The kitchen still contained the massive pots, now rusted and filled with rainwater, and the reflection chamber in the basement was as dark and terrible as he remembered. Standing in that place of horror, Samuel thought about all the boys who had passed through Pinecrest, the ones who had survived and the ones who had not, and he made a promise to their memory. The promise was this, that he would never stop fighting against systems that crushed human dignity. Never accept that the poor and powerless deserved their suffering. Never be silent in the face of institutional abuse. He understood, in a way that only someone who had experienced Pinecrest could understand, that freedom was not simply the absence of physical chains, but the presence of genuine choice. That true liberty required not just legal rights, but material security and social respect. That a society that allowed children to be broken in the name of reform was a society that had lost its moral foundation. The lessons of Pinecrest, paid for in suffering and death, could not be forgotten, because they revealed fundamental truths about power and resistance, about human cruelty and human resilience. Samuel's writings in his later years became increasingly philosophical, grappling with the meaning of what he had experienced. He wrote about how institutions like Pinecrest served a purpose beyond their stated mission of reformation. They were laboratories of control, experiments in breaking human will and creating docile subjects. Pike had been explicit about this in his journal, but Samuel argued that the same logic operated throughout society in forms less extreme, but no less pernicious. The factory that paid starvation wages, the tenement that charged exorbitant rent for squalid conditions, the court that punished poverty as crime, all of these served to break people's spirits, to convince them that their suffering was natural and deserved, to prevent them from imagining or demanding anything better. Pinecrest was not an aberration, but a distillation of a broader system of oppression. But Samuel also wrote about resistance, about the spark of defiance that even the most brutal institution could not fully extinguish. He thought about the boys at Pinecrest who had maintained their humanity despite everything, who had helped each other, who had risked punishment to show kindness to the weak and sick. He thought about Mrs. Fowler, whose courage in passing on their message had been the key to exposing Pike's crimes. He thought about Mitchell and the Rangers and the doctor who had been willing to act on evidence of abuse rather than dismiss it as the lies of criminals. Resistance, Samuel argued, was not a single dramatic act, but 1,000 small refusals to accept the unacceptable. A stubborn insistence on dignity in the face of systematic degradation. The message Samuel ultimately drew from his experience at Pinecrest was about freedom, both individual and collective. Freedom meant not just legal rights, though those were important, but material conditions that allowed people to live with dignity. Adequate food, shelter, medical care, education, meaningful work. A boy who was starving, who was being poisoned, who was kept in darkness, was not free in any meaningful sense, regardless of what the law said. And freedom required solidarity, the recognition that an injury to one was an injury to all, that the boys at Pinecrest could not be freed as individuals, but only through collective resistance and the support of those outside who were willing to act on their behalf. The dream of the powerful, Samuel wrote, was of a society where each person stood alone, isolated and powerless. The hope of the oppressed was in recognizing their common cause and acting together. In 1915, at the age of 44, Samuel died of complications from the damage his body had sustained at Pinecrest. His digestive system had never fully recovered from years of consuming contaminated food, and the infections that had scarred his lungs made him vulnerable to pneumonia. He died as he had lived his adult life, working on an article about prison conditions, his pen falling from his hand mid-sentence. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, former inmates of reform schools, labor organizers, journalists, lawyers who had fought for juvenile justice reform. They remembered him not as a victim, but as a fighter, someone who had transformed his own suffering into a weapon against the systems that had created it. The legacy of Pinecrest lived on in the reforms it sparked and in the continued vigilance of those who understood that such institutions could emerge again if society grew complacent. Mitchell, who outlived Samuel by many years, continued to investigate and expose abuse in juvenile corrections, prisons, and other closed institutions. He wrote Samuel's obituary himself, concluding with words that captured something essential. Samuel Hayes spent his youth in a hell designed to break him, but he emerged unbroken. His life stands as testimony to the resilience of the human spirit and as a warning that freedom must be constantly defended against those who would use authority to crush it. We honor his memory not with tears but with continued struggle, not with words but with action, not by accepting the world as it is, but by insisting on the world as it should be. The story of Pinecrest Reform School and Warden Augustus Pike became a cautionary tale, taught in schools of social work and criminal justice as an example of how noble intentions, the stated goal of reforming troubled youth, could mask systematic cruelty when combined with unchecked authority and contempt for the poor. Historians who studied the period noted that Pinecrest was remarkable not for being unique, but for being exposed. How many other institutions operated in similar ways, their crimes hidden by isolation and by society's indifference to the suffering of those deemed unworthy? How many boys were broken in body and spirit by systems that claimed to be saving them? The questions haunted those who understood that justice required not just punishing individual wrongdoers, but examining and transforming the social structures that enabled abuse. The physical site of Pinecrest remained abandoned for decades, becoming a local legend. People claimed to hear screams coming from the ruins at night, though this was likely just wind through broken windows and the creaking of old timbers. Children dared each other to approach the fence and touch the rusted gates. Eventually, in the 1950s, the buildings were demolished and the land sold for agricultural use. Today, nothing remains of the institution except historical records and the memories preserved in Mitchell's articles and Samuel's writings. But the lessons of Pinecrest about the nature of power and the necessity of resistance, about the fragility of freedom and the constant vigilance required to protect it, remain relevant to any age that grapples with questions of justice, authority, and human dignity. The story forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths, that cruelty can wear the mask of righteousness, that authority without accountability will tend toward abuse, that society's indifference to the suffering of the powerless enables horrors that would be unthinkable if perpetrated against the privileged. Pike was not a monster in the sense of being incomprehensible. His methods were logical extensions of beliefs about discipline, obedience, and the proper place of the poor that were widespread in his time and have not entirely disappeared from ours. The boys of Pinecrest were not statistics, but individuals with hopes and dreams and potential that was deliberately destroyed by a system that viewed them as raw material for exploitation rather than as human beings deserving of care. The final question Pinecrest poses is about complicity and responsibility. Pike could not have operated his institution without the support, or at least the indifference, of the broader society. Judges sent boys there knowing little or nothing about conditions. State officials accepted falsified reports without investigation. Suppliers sold condemned meat, knowing it would be fed to children. Guards and staff carried out abuse, either believing it was justified or choosing not to question orders. And the general public, when confronted with claims of mistreatment, largely dismissed them as the whining of criminals who deserved whatever they got. The exposure of Pinecrest forced a reckoning with this web of complicity, a recognition that systematic abuse required systematic enablement, and that preventing future Pinecrests required not just punishing the obvious perpetrators, but examining the attitudes and structures that had allowed it to operate. Samuel Hayes's life and struggle, from his arrest for the crime of hunger, to his transformation into an advocate for reform, to his early death from the consequences of institutionalized poisoning, stands as a testament to both the worst and best of humanity. It shows what people are capable of when they have unchecked power over the powerless, but also what people are capable of when they refuse to accept injustice. The boys of Pinecrest were meant to be broken, to be made into obedient servants who would never question or resist. Some were broken, their spirits crushed beyond recovery. But others, like Samuel, emerged from that crucible with a refined understanding of justice and a commitment to fight for it that no amount of suffering could extinguish. Their resistance, their refusal to accept that they deserved their fate, their insistence on their own humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization, proved that the human spirit, while fragile, is also remarkably resilient. The poisoned meat that Pike fed to the boys of Pinecrest was intended as a tool of control, a way of keeping them weak and sick and unable to resist. But in the end, it became evidence of his crimes, physical proof that could not be denied or dismissed. The bottles of rotting meat that Samuel and his friends smuggled out of the institution, specimens of the daily poison they were forced to consume, became symbols of resistance, evidence that the powerless could document and expose their oppression even under the most constrained circumstances. That meat, meant to break their bodies, became instead the means of breaking Pike's system. It is a fitting irony that the instrument of oppression became the tool of liberation, that what was meant to destroy became what preserved the memory and ensured the accountability. In the years after Pinecrest's exposure, every child who was spared similar abuse, every reform school that was forced to meet basic standards of care, every law that was passed to protect juvenile inmates, these were victories purchased with the suffering of the boys who had endured Pike's regime. Their pain was not redeemed by these changes, because pain is never truly redeemed. But it was given meaning by the commitment of survivors like Samuel to ensure that it would not be forgotten and would not be repeated. This is the burden and the promise that emerges from tragedies like Pinecrest, that the suffering of the past must inform the struggles of the present, that memory is not passive but active, not about looking back but about building forward, not about mourning but about fighting.